In a legislative chamber, an assembly of professionally dressed people stand behind wooden desks arranged in a tiered semicircle facing a long rostrum, while additional people stand and look on from the gallery above. Figure 9. 1. The Congress of Peru is a unicameral legislature in which legislators are selected to represent each regional district as well as 2 special districts for Lima Province and Peruvian citizens abroad. Seats are assigned based on population in multi-member districts. Credit: President del Congreso en sesión solemne by Congreso de la República del Perú /Flickr, CC by 20. Chapter Outline 9. 1. What do legislatures do? 9.2. What is the difference between parliamentary and presidential systems? 9.3. What is the difference between unicameral and bicameral systems? 9. 4. The decline of legislative influence. A legislature is a deliberative body that is granted the authority to create laws to govern a society. When the term legislature comes up, people often think of national legislatures, such as the U.S. Congress or the National Congress of Argentina. However, city councils and state legislatures also play a significant role in governing our everyday lives, and supranational legislatures, such as the European Parliament, can have a profound impact by setting policies on trade and migration across many countries. Though legislatures are deliberative bodies generally focused on passing laws, their role is much more complex. This chapter will explore what it is that legislatures do, examine the impact that differences in legislative structure can have on the political system, and consider the challenges that legislatures face. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the different aspects of a legislature's work, discuss the general components of the legislative process, outline how legislatures organize to accomplish their work, define different ways legislators represent constituents. Setting aside the challenge of running for re-election, there are many tasks involved in a legislator's job, including creating new laws to solve emerging policy problems, evaluating existing arrangements to make sure they still work, staying in touch with constituents, both to keep them up to date with legislative work and to find out what they think about current issues, and overseeing other parts of the government to ensure that the will of the legislature is being carried out. This section will examine each part of a legislator's job in greater detail to better understand the roles that legislatures play in the political world. Not all legislatures around the world have the same powers and functions. Some legislatures, particularly in non-democracies, have limited roles in governing but provide other important functions. In some systems, the legislature can serve a more consultative role, even if it doesn't have final decision-making power. Still, other legislatures are endowed with powers that make them co-equal with the various branches of government. Finally, there are some legislatures that are the supreme decision-makers when it comes to policy making. Recognizing that these differences exist is an important component of understanding the roles legislatures play in society. Because legislatures play a particularly important role in democratic systems, much of this chapter focuses on those systems. What can I do? Critical thinking and legislative analysis. Lawmakers wearing headscarves sit at a long conference table set with bottles of water and small plates of food. Figure 9. 2 Somali women lawmakers attend a workshop in Mogadishu aimed at empowering lawmakers to protect and promote the rights of women, children, and other marginalized groups. Credit: 2018-02-28 Somali Women Legislators 2 by AMISOM Public Information /Ilyas Ahmed /Flickr, CC01. 0. When people study legislatures, they often examine why members of a legislature voted a certain way on a particular piece of legislation, why a certain member was chosen to serve on a particular legislative committee, or even why some policy elements were or were not included within the text of a proposed piece of legislation. Being able to answer and explain the why requires one of the most important skills that studying political science helps you develop: critical thinking. When you learn how to explain why someone voted yes or no on a piece of legislation, you are really developing the ability to explain anything in any field or specialization. Critical thinking skills are among the skills employers value most. 1. The ability to explain complex situations, to solve problems, and to make sense of situations that seemingly defy rational explanations provides the foundation on which you can build many diverse career paths. Passing laws. Who comes up with ideas? One of the legislature's main jobs is to pass laws in order to solve policy problems. Ideas for these laws come from many places. Constituents might go to members of legislatures for help solving a problem in their community, such as a need for more school funding. A newspaper might publish an investigation that brings attention to an important issue. Often, organizations that work on a particular issue reach out to legislators. A president or prime minister or another member of the executive branch routinely offers policy proposals to the legislature for their consideration. Finally, ideas can come from the legislators themselves. It is quite common for a member of a legislature to develop a passion for and expertise in a particular policy area. In order for a law to be created or changed, a legislator or group of legislators must be willing to work to solve the problem. Often, the person who introduces a piece of legislation is known as its sponsor. The sponsor, or if a group of legislators introduces legislation, the co-sponsors argues on behalf of a piece of legislation in debate and meets with other legislators to try to get their support for the bill. Once legislators realize there is a problem they need to solve, they set out to learn more about the policy area. They can do this a number of ways, including by reading research and reports. Often, they hold hearings in which they consult policy experts. Hearings can be useful for bringing many different stakeholders and perspectives together in one place. How are ideas debated? Following the information gathering process, legislators decide how to proceed to fix the problem. In most cases, they decide that the best way to solve a problem is to pass a law. Laws concerning the relationship between the government and individuals that apply to all people are called public laws. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is a good example of a public law, as it made changes to the health care system in the United States that affected U.S. society as a whole. Public laws cover a huge range of topics, including the economy and government operation, health care and civil rights, defense and foreign policy, and everything in between. The process of writing a law involves taking all the ideas proposed and all the information gathered and turning them into a formal text to circulate and debate. In a busy state Senate chamber, professionally dressed legislators, some working at laptops, sit behind desks covered in papers or stand conferring with their colleagues while a person stands at a podium facing them. Figure 9. 3 members of the Colorado State Senate debate the budget in 2011. Members listen as their colleague makes a speech, but they also have conversations and look over reference material. Budgets are critical pieces of legislation, as money is vital for government agencies and programs to operate. Credit. Budget Debate 2011 by Colorado Senate GOP/Flickr, public domain. The exact process of debate differs across legislatures, but most require a public debate, that is, a debate that is open to all members before the legislature votes on the proposed piece of legislation. Most systems have a set of parliamentary procedures or rules that govern the structure of debate. Common procedural components include the right of the minority to speak in a debate, every member having the right to a vote, and only one piece of business being addressed at a time. 2. A legislator surrounded by a photographer, a camera person, and many seated colleagues, some of whom applaud, stands holding a piece of paper at one of many connected, numbered wooden desks arranged in tiered rows. Figure 9. 4 members of the European Parliament debate and vote on the withdrawal agreement of the United Kingdom from the European Union. Credit. Members debate and vote on the EU-UK withdrawal agreement by European Parliament/Flickr, CC BY 4. 0. Copyright European Union 2020 Source, EP. How do laws get passed? Following the conclusion of debate, legislation is put to a vote to determine whether it will become law. For the passage of ordinary laws, most countries require a bill to gain the votes of a majority of legislators. One of the basic principles of democratic societies is majority rule, or the idea that the decision of the majority, 50% of the chamber's membership plus one member, determines the decision of the chamber on most items of business. However, in some instances, change cannot take place without a supermajority. Supermajority voting rules require more than a majority to pass legislation. These rules come into play most often for decisions that are considered especially important or consequential. For example, countries that allow the legislature to amend the constitution usually require supermajorities to pass such amendments. Supermajority voting rules for constitutional amendments can require anywhere from 3/5 to 3/4 of the chamber's membership to agree to the proposed measure. For example, changes to the Japanese constitution require the support of 2/3 of each chamber in the Diet, the Japanese national legislature, and a majority in a public referendum. Countries where the parliament can call early elections also require a supermajority to agree to these elections. In the United Kingdom, at a minimum, parliamentary elections must happen every 5 years. However, if 2/3 of Parliament agrees, the legislature can be dissolved and early elections will be held. A supermajority may also be required to remove individuals from office. In the United States, the process of impeachment, which is the first step in removing a member of the executive or judicial branch from office, requires only a majority vote in the House of Representatives to move forward to trial in the Senate. Once the trial takes place, however, 2/3 of the Senate must vote in favor of conviction for the individual to be removed. So while the vast majority of laws and legislative action require the support of a simple majority of legislators, some instances require that a higher threshold be met. In some cases, legislatures implement rules that create supermajority requirements for ordinary legislation. In the United States Senate, there is a tradition of unlimited debate on legislation. This means that a legislator can delay or prevent a vote on a piece of legislation by insisting that there is still more to debate, a practice commonly referred to as a filibuster. 3. In the modern Senate, any member can declare that they are filibustering or still debating an issue, which stops the issue from coming to a vote. A vote only happens when 60 senators vote in favor of a cloture motion to end the debate. 4. Because any member can invoke a filibuster for any reason, there is essentially a de facto supermajority requirement for legislation to pass in the United States Senate. The process discussed here, in which ideas come freely from all actors, are debated seriously, and can result in changes, is most characteristic of legislatures in democratic regimes. Legislatures in authoritarian countries may be far less independent, far less capable of policy-making and representation, and far more responsive to the authoritarian leader. They do, however, play important roles in their political systems, such as making their governments more stable than authoritarian governments without legislatures. 5. Authoritarian legislatures provide a venue where key social groups may make their voices heard in policy debates, encouraging that stability. 6. Additionally, the legislature maintains a role in the policy process, as the authoritarian leader may choose to delegate decision-making authority in particular policy areas to actors with their own policy preferences. 7. Although legislatures exist on a spectrum of power and independence, with legislatures in democratic systems tending to be more powerful and independent than legislatures in authoritarian regimes, all legislatures play a significant role in their systems of government. Organizing the legislature's work. The work of legislatures requires a large number of people to collaborate. Every legislator has their own goals, things they want to take credit for and blame they are trying to avoid, and everyone thinks they are right. Even when individuals agree that a particular policy is worth working on, they may disagree on the exact solution. Legislatures must create structures to keep their members moving productively in roughly the same direction. Political parties. One of the main ways legislatures organize themselves is through political parties, which are discussed in detail in Chapter 8, Interest Groups, Political Parties, and Elections. Political parties are groups of people who typically have similar ideas on policy that they use to help candidates run for election and govern. 8. One of the ways political parties help govern is in determining decision-making authority. Because most votes require a majority to pass, many political systems give additional decision-making and leadership authority to the political party that holds a majority of seats. The majority party, or the political party that holds more than 50% of seats in the chamber, is often granted the ability to set the schedule for what bills get debated. They also typically control more seats on legislative committees, and because of these powers, they are typically more likely to get their preferred policies enacted into law. A minority party is any political party that does not have more than 50% of seats in the chamber. In democracies, minority parties can play an important legislative role, as they provide official expression of political and policy ideas that differ from those of the majority. They present their ideas in debate and vote against legislation they disapprove of, even when that legislation is likely to pass and become law. 9. The exact nature of the relationship between the majority and the minority depends on the number of parties in the legislature, and that number depends on what electoral system is in place. Some systems result in the dominance of two main political parties. In the U.S. government, for example, the Democratic and Republican parties have primary control. Other systems make it easier for many parties to end up with seats in the legislature. In legislatures where many political parties hold seats, parties often need to join together in coalitions to create a majority in the chamber. For example, in the 2020 Irish elections, no single party gained a majority. The party that gained the most votes, Fianna Fáil, joined with two supporting parties, Fine Gael and the Green Party, to form a majority coalition. 10 coalition governments can be more fragile than outright majority governments because if the relationship between the parties in the agreement breaks down, a party might withdraw its support from the coalition, throwing the balance of power in the legislature back into question. Video. Ireland coalition deal. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Greens to form coalition government. Why might some parties want to be a part of a coalition government? Why might some parties not want to be in a coalition government? In this news segment, members of the Irish Parliament from different parties discuss what their parties were looking for from a new governing coalition following the 2020 elections. Squares arranged in an upside-down U-shape show the distribution of seats and party diversity in the lower chamber of the Irish Parliament following the 2020 elections. Fine Gael, Sinn Féin and the Green Party held the most seats. Independents and Fianna Fáil held more than 10 seats each, and 5 other distinct groups also held seats. Figure 9. 5. Following the 2020 elections in Ireland, no single party had enough seats in the Dáil Éireann, the lower chamber of the Irish legislature, to form a majority government. Instead, the largest party, Fianna Fáil, created a coalition to govern the country with the backing of Fine Gael and the Green Party. Note, this figure represents the numbers of seats each party secured, but not necessarily the actual seating arrangement. Attribution, Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC BY 40 license. Committees. Another way legislatures organize is through legislative committees, groups of lawmakers who work together on the same policy area. Legislatures try to have enough committees to cover all major policy areas, and while the number of members on each committee varies, most systems require that all parties be allowed space on a committee. That means individual members of small parties typically serve on more committees than members of bigger parties, which can afford to spread their members around. Organizing legislative work through committees facilitates specialization and legislative delegation. When individual legislators specialize, they delve more deeply into one or two policy areas and develop expertise on those issues. This expertise helps them better understand the nature of the problem and analyze different solutions. Legislative delegation goes hand in hand with specialization. When a legislator is tasked with voting on an issue outside their areas of expertise, rather than having to do extensive research, that legislator can rely on the opinion of members of their political party who are on the relevant policy committee. If those members support the legislation, it can help the legislator decide whether they should support the legislation. 2. The party delegates responsibility for learning about that issue to party members who sit on the relevant committee. Often, when people think of legislators, they think of people for whom writing laws and doing the work of government is a full-time job. While that may be true in many situations, not every legislature is a professional legislature. Professional legislatures meet year-round. The work of the legislature is the legislators' only or primary job. They have paid professional staff, and they earn a salary that reflects the status of the office and the effort it requires. For example, the California State Assembly, the lower chamber of the California State Legislature, is in session from January to September every year. During the September to December period, members are often in their home districts, continuing to do work and preparing for the next legislative session. Members earn a salary of approximately $115,000 per year plus per diem. 11. In contrast, non-professional legislatures, sometimes also called citizen legislatures, are part-time legislatures where members meet for a set period of time, and then once the legislative session ends, go home to their districts to the job they held prior to the session or to other work. The Texas legislature is an example of a non-professional legislature. Members meet starting on the second Tuesday in January for 140 days in odd-numbered years and make $7,200 per year plus a per diem when in Austin, the state capital. 12. The governor, who has the power to recall the legislature to special sessions for 30 days at a time, generally handles any decisions that need to be made in between sessions. This tends to make governors in states with non-professional legislatures very powerful. Legislative professionalism can have a substantial impact on a legislature's capacity to do its work. Short legislative sessions limit the amount that legislatures can accomplish in a given session, requiring clear prioritization and swift leadership. Proponents of non-professional legislatures argue that shorter sessions help constrain the cost of legislators' salaries and the size of their staffs, and that they prevent the expansion of government. 13. While each government must decide for itself whether a professional or a non-professional legislature is the correct fit, it is certainly true that the capacity of non-professional legislatures is limited. Representation of constituents. Every member of a legislature has constituents, the people they are elected to represent. The connection between legislator and constituent can take many forms, and the particular form can have a substantive impact on the relationship. Single-member districts versus multi-member districts. The way in which legislators are assigned to their districts affects the legislator-constituent relationship. In some systems, each legislator is elected to represent a specific geographic district. For example, in Canada, the House of Commons represents 338 ridings. The Member of Parliament elected from Halifax, Nova Scotia, is only responsible for representing the constituents in Halifax, and only the voters in that district can vote in the election to select the representative for that district. This type of system can allow a legislator to become familiar with the particular issues that affect their district and to potentially be more responsive to their constituents. However, it can also heighten geographic differences and potential tensions between regions. A map of Canada uses white lines to demarcate each of 300+ federal electoral districts. Highly populated metropolitan areas including Vancouver, Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, the Greater Toronto Area, Ottawa-Gatineau, Montreal, and Quebec City are enlarged to show geographically smaller districts. Figure 9. 6. Each area outlined represents one riding or federal electoral district in Canada and is represented by one member of Parliament in the House of Commons. Credit. Modification of work by Intrigue Blue derivative of work by Tasty Cakes / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. This contrasts with countries such as Mozambique or Israel, where the legislature represents the country as a whole, without any geographic divisions. For example, in Israel, voters indicate their preferred party, and regardless of whether they are voting in Eilat in the south or Haifa in the north, they are voting for and will be represented by the same politicians. In these systems of national legislatures, members are less likely to have particular regional loyalties that could affect policy making. However, political parties often play a larger role, so whether specific geographic or national legislative districts produce better representation is debatable. 14. Whether or not members of the legislature are elected from specific geographic districts, there is considerable variation in the number of legislators who can represent a single district. National-level districts such as Mozambique, where every member of the legislature could potentially be elected by every voter, are the extreme, but many systems have multi-member districts, where multiple legislators represent a single geographic district. Depending on the rules of the system, these members may be elected at the same time or at different times, and they may be from the same party or different parties. For example, in the United States Senate, each state is its own electoral district with 2 members, each of whom is elected on separate 6-year cycles. These 2 members may or may not be of the same political party. After the 2020 electoral cycle, John Tester, a Democrat who will be up for re-election in 2024, and Steve Daines, a Republican who will be up for re-election in 2026, both represented Montana. The number of seats allotted per district can vary considerably in multi-member districts. In the Folketing or Danish Parliament, there are 12 constituencies. The smallest constituencies have 2 seats in Parliament, and the largest district has 20 seats. The division of seats across constituencies is often done to recognize differences in population density. One of those smaller constituencies is Bornholm, which had 31,214 voters in 2019 and elected 2 members to parliament, one each from the 2 largest parties in the legislature. Venstre, also known as Denmark's Liberal Party, and Socialdemokratiet, or the Social Democrats. 15. Compare this with the largest constituency in the country, Sjællands, which had 628,910 voters, and divided 20 seats across 8 different political parties based on the percentage of the vote that each of those parties received in the constituency. 16. By contrast, some electoral systems use single-member districts. In these systems, the legislature is made up of many geographic districts, with only one legislator representing each district. The U.S. House of Representatives uses a single-member district system in which the total number of seats in the chamber is distributed across the states based on population, with more populous states receiving many more seats. Each state can decide how it wants to draw its individual districts. The relationship between the legislator and the constituent, which varies depending on whether a political system uses single-member or multi-member districts, has been the subject of considerable research. Some scholars argue that geographically based single-member districts can better represent racial and ethnic minorities, because members of a community who are clustered together can elect a representative from that community. 17. But scholars have also found that multi-member districts can better ensure that women are elected to public office, because each community can select more than one representative. 18. Some scholars contend that multi-member districts can result in poorer representation of constituents overall, as the greater the number of seats in a district, the harder it is for constituents to monitor legislator behavior, and the greater the likelihood that legislators will make decisions that are not in line with the majority of constituents' preferences. 19. The changing political landscape. Changing face of legislatures. A bar graph shows increases in the percent of legislators who were women between 2008 and 2019 by region of the world. Though percentages increased in all regions, none achieved parity. 50%. Nordic countries 43%, and the Caribbean 42% came closest, while the Middle East and North Africa had the lowest percentage, 17%. The biggest gains, from 19% to 32%, occurred in Central America. Figure 9. 7. The numbers of women in legislatures around the world are increasing. Source: Pew Research Center. Analysis of data from Interparliamentary Union. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. As discussed in Chapter 8. Interest groups, political parties, and elections. In the 21st century, the U.S. Congress has grown more and more diverse. In 2001, only 12% of members of Congress were people of color, and 13% were women. By 2021, 24% of members identified as people of color, and 27% identified as women. 20. Indeed, this pattern of increasing representation is true in most places around the world. For example, the percentage of seats held by women in legislatures globally has increased from 18% in 2008 to 24% in 2019. 21. Though the membership of the U.S. Congress is not yet as diverse as the U.S. population, the trend in membership demographics echoes the country's growing diversity. Why is this increasing diversity important? Increased diversity translates to a greater variety of life experiences and perspectives. A woman whose parents came to the United States as refugees will have a different perspective on the world from that of a man whose family has been in the United States for generations. Representatives bring their life experiences and nuances to policymaking, potentially better representing their constituents. The idea that underrepresented minorities receive better representation from people with similar demographic characteristics is called descriptive representation. In contrast, substantive representation is the phenomenon in which people are represented by legislators who hold the same ideological or policy beliefs, regardless of demographic characteristics. There is no guarantee that a match between a legislator's ethnicity or gender and some subset of their constituents means the legislator will represent the political interests of that constituency, or that a mismatch between a legislator's demographic identity and their primary constituency means they will not represent their constituents' interests. However, descriptive representation has been found to improve the probability that a demographic group's interests will be represented. 22. A legislator's identity may help them represent their constituents, but it is not a guarantee. A legislator may also effectively represent individuals of genders, races, and ethnicities other than their own. Types of representation. In democracies, those who are elected to office are entrusted with acting in the interest of the people they represent. But how do elected officials decide what is in the best interests of those constituents? Edmund Burke, a political philosopher who served in the British Parliament in the 18th century, posited two primary ways legislators can act to represent their constituents. 23. In one view, the legislator is a delegate of the people who elected them. The legislator's obligation is to learn the people's policy preferences and their views about different issues and to directly convey those preferences via legislative action. The delegate model rests on the ideas that people understand politics and policy well enough to form thoughtful opinions and to convey them to their representatives, and that the legislator's personal preferences should be set aside. Alternatively, the legislator can be a trustee for their constituents. In the trustee model, though the legislator should still learn about the voters' preferences, once in government they must use their own judgment and knowledge of policy to decide what is in constituents' best interests, even if it is contrary to those constituents' views. The trustee model is based on the idea that the average voter is either not sufficiently informed about politics and policy or does not have enough time to develop that knowledge in order to know what is actually in their best interests. Consequently, the representative, whose job it is to learn these facts, is better situated to make these decisions. If the delegate and trustee models are at opposite ends of the spectrum, in practice, most legislators fall somewhere in between the two extremes. This kind of representation, where the legislator seeks a balance between delegate and trustee approaches, is sometimes also called the Politico model of representation. 24. In this model, a legislator relies on the delegate approach, weighing the opinion of their constituents quite heavily in their decision-making, particularly when their constituents feel strongly about an issue. But in policy areas where either the legislator has more policy knowledge or there is a lack of public interest, they will rely on their own judgment. The issue of foreign aid in the United States provides a classic example of this dichotomy. When asked in opinion polls, Americans often say the United States government spends too much on aid to other countries. 25. However, in reality, foreign aid accounts for only about 1% of the federal budget and has broad support from both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. 26. Despite the expressed opinions of constituents, members of Congress often support these policies because of a discrepancy in information between legislators and constituents, where the legislators have far more information than the average constituent about the costs and benefits of the programs. Show me the data. Two pie charts show that, when given more information, respondents were half as likely to say levels of U.S. foreign aid were too high and 10–15% more likely to say they were about right or too low. Figure 9. Aid information can change perceptions. Source: Kaiser Family Foundation Health Tracking Poll conducted December 29, 2014. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. Foreign policy demonstrates the complexity of delegate representation. Many Americans have only a little bit of knowledge about how much the United States spends on foreign aid, generally believing that the United States spends a significant portion of the budget in that policy area. However, when Americans are presented with information about how much the United States actually spends, their opinions tend to change, with more respondents saying that the United States spends either too little or the right amount. This gap between constituents' knowledge and their opinions means that legislators must decide when, on which policies, and to what degree to weigh their constituents' preferences against their own. A fourth type of representation, partisan representation, differs from the other three. In delegate, trustee, and politico representation, the primary relationship is between the elected official and the constituent. In partisan representation, the primary relationship is between the legislator and the political party. Partisan representation relies on the idea that legislators must always vote with their political party. Depending on the wishes of the constituents, partisan representation can appear very similar to delegate or trustee representation, but it is motivated not directly by the desires of the constituents about a particular policy area, but instead by a legislator's belief that their constituents want them to be a loyal party member across all issues. 27. The prevalence of partisan representation varies across countries. As in some political systems, the baseline expectation is that legislators will vote with their parties the vast majority of the time, while in other political systems, members are allowed more freedom from their political parties. 28. Where can I engage? Contact your representative. The Prime Minister of Dominica sits next to an aide at a long table draped in a colorful cloth in a small, informal room, focusing on a constituent sitting across from them. Figure 9. Prime Minister Roosevelt Scarrett of Dominica Center meets one-on-one with residents of Sinku in 2017. Most politicians want to hear from their constituents, as this can help them understand the issues that people are facing and the areas that might benefit from additional government work. Credit PM meets one-on-one with residents in Sinku by Roosevelt Scarrett/Flickr, public domain. In many democracies, members of the legislature care what their constituents think about various issues. They want to know which issues their constituents think are important, whether there is support or opposition for particular pieces of legislation, and whether or not their constituents approve of their performance in their job. This means that it is very important for constituents to reach out to their representatives. There are a number of ways you can contact your representative, via letter, email, or phone call. Check USA.gov to find contact information for national, state, and local representatives. While every legislator prioritizes what kinds of communications they take most seriously, 29 research suggests that many forms of contact will have at least some effect on legislators. 30. It's easy these days to find contact information for your legislator on the internet, so use your voice to reach out. Some key things to keep in mind: be polite, be clear about which issue or concern you are contacting them about and whether you support or oppose it, and remember, you are most effective when you are contacting your own representative, the legislature's oversight role. The process of regularly monitoring and reviewing the actions of agencies or other political actors, oversight, is important in democracies where a system of checks and balances between the different branches of government is designed to ensure that power is shared across the system. In these democracies, legislative oversight of the bureaucracy provides an important check on the power of the executive branch. 31. European parliamentarians sit in numbered rows of connected wooden desks, facing forward and in some cases looking through papers. Figure 9. 10 members of the European Parliament hold a hearing on the suitability of incoming members of the European Commission. Credit: Hearings, Ylva Johansson, Sweden, Home Affairs by European Parliament/Flickr, CC BY 4. 0. Copyright European Union 2020 Source, EP. Hearings. Just as committees hold hearings to learn more about policy areas, they can also hold hearings to conduct legislative oversight. In these hearings, committees can gather information to ensure that an agency's actions are in line with that agency's assigned mission. Committees and agencies are often paired up based on relevant policy jurisdiction. For example, in the UK Parliament, the Health and Social Care Select Committee has jurisdiction over the Department of Health and Social Care and its 29 agencies and public bodies, which include the National Health Service, NHS. The committee regularly holds inquiries into issues in its domain, which in 2020 included the delivery of core NHS services during the COVID-19 pandemic and the safety of maternity services in England, among others. 32. Parliamentary questions. Hearings are not the only way legislatures get information. In many systems, particularly parliamentary systems, a formal process allows legislators to ask questions of the bureaucracy that the bureaucracy is then required to answer. This process can take many forms. In some countries, there is a designated time during the week when legislators can question ministers, including the Prime Minister, in person. In other countries, legislators must submit questions in writing, but they can do so at any time, and the bureaucracy must respond in writing by a specific deadline. Sometimes governmental systems have a mechanism for both in-person and written questions. For example, in the German Bundestag, after every weekly cabinet meeting, ministers are available to answer questions about current policy for 35 minutes. This is followed by a 2-hour question and answer session relating to questions submitted in advance. 33. Video. Prime Minister's Questions (PMQs), 28 April 2021. In this video, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom takes questions from the Leader of the Opposition and other members of Parliament about policy and government administration. Parliamentary questions have one key advantage over hearings. Any individual legislator may submit a question. One way or another, hearings require the cooperation of multiple members of Parliament. That cooperation may be passive, as when members of the committee who are not interested in the issue choose not to participate in the hearing, or it may be active, as when members help organize the panel of witnesses or reinforce a line of questioning after a colleague's time to speak expires. Questions, whether written or oral, do not require cooperation from any other member of the legislature. This makes questions a potent tool for members of minority parties. 34. They can launch inquiries into issues via questions in cases where they might not be able to get cooperation for a hearing in a committee. In addition, any member of a legislative body can ask a question related to any policy area. They need not be a member of the relevant committee to participate in parliamentary questioning. 35. This means that legislators are not restricted from participating in policy areas that interest them simply because of jurisdiction. Budgets. In many democratic systems, the legislative branch is in charge of what is sometimes referred to as the appropriations process, whereby the legislature allocates the government's money to the various agencies in charge of implementing policy. This power of the purse is both a carrot and a stick that legislatures can use to gain compliance with their policy-making priorities. 36. A legislature is likely to allocate more money to those agencies that follow the legislature's direction and do what members of the legislature consider important work, and to cut the budgets of those agencies that either do not follow the legislature's directives or do work the majority of legislators consider relatively unimportant. For agencies, this is critical. Nothing gets done without money. The legislature's budgetary authority can be one of its greatest tools to ensure the compliance of the agencies of the executive branch. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define parliamentary and presidential systems and give examples of each. Articulate the differences in member selection in different types of systems. Describe how the relationship between the legislature and the executive changes depending on the type of governing system. At this point, it should be clear that there is considerable variation across legislatures in terms of what they do and how they do it. 2. Institutional features can play a substantial role in influencing the legislature's role in a political system, the type of system, and the number of chambers. This section focuses on the first of these two features, namely, the differences between parliamentary and presidential systems. In most democracies, there are three main branches of government: a legislative branch which makes laws, an executive branch which oversees the implementation and enforcement of laws, and a judicial branch which decides whether the actions of individuals, groups, and institutions align with those laws and determines whether those actions, as well as any laws, are in conflict with the Constitution. The differences between the main types of systems center on how the legislative and executive branches relate to each other. In a parliamentary system, there is a very close relationship between the legislative and executive branches, as the head of the executive, often called the Prime Minister, is also a leader in the legislative branch. In a presidential system, there is a much stronger separation of powers between the legislative and the executive. In these systems, the head of the executive, often called the president, has only a limited role in the legislative process. A system with both a president and a prime minister is called a semi-presidential system. These systems share some features of both parliamentary and presidential systems. Because the differences between parliamentary and presidential systems are profound, the chapter will discuss these two types of systems in more depth. How members get selected. Who has the power to pick the people who make the laws? Does the public elect the members of the legislature, or do other directly elected legislators appoint them? Are legislators selected via executive appointment? The answers to these questions matter because the method of selection can indicate whose interests a legislator will represent, as the person or people who put someone in power can have a decided impact on whose values and preferences shape law. A world map codes countries by form of government. presidential republic, semi-presidential republic, parliamentary republic, constitutional monarchy, absolute monarchy, and others. Most presidential republics are in the Americas, Africa, and the Middle East. Most semi-presidential republics are in Europe and Africa, and most parliamentary republics are in Europe and Asia. Figure 9. 11. In 2021, most countries had some form of presidential, parliamentary, or semi-presidential government. Credit, Modification of Forms of Government 2021 by Newfrefers 87/derivative of work by Slursky/Wikimedia Commons, CC01. 0. Legislative elections. Most legislatures around the world select members via public elections, in which citizens vote for either a candidate or a political party to represent them in the legislature. There are three main types of direct legislative election systems: proportional representation systems, plurality or first-past-the-post systems, and mixed systems. Within each of these sets of electoral rules, there are many variations, but all the political systems within a given type share certain common characteristics. Electoral systems in which the relative level of support for political parties in the population is reflected in the legislature are proportional representation systems. If 10% of the public supports a particular political party and shows up to vote for them, that party can expect to hold roughly 10% of the seats in the legislature. The principle behind this system is that all preferences should be reflected in government, not just those views that have majority support. There are many different variations of proportional representation, often based on the way in which votes are translated into seats in government. Most variations of proportional representation require multi-member districts in order to have seats to divide among the winners. In the lower house of Brazil's National Congress, the 26 federal states and the federal district are each allotted between 8 and 70 seats, based on population. 37. The electoral result in each district determines the number of seats the party will receive in the legislature. This combines proportional representation by party, in which the amount of support a party has determines the amount of seats they receive, with proportional representation by population, in which more populous regions receive more representation than less populous regions. Additionally, most systems have a minimum threshold of votes needed to gain seats in the legislature, ranging from 3 to 5% of the electorate in most countries. So although proportional representation allows smaller parties to gain seats, minimum threshold requirements are thought to prevent small fringe political parties from gaining seats in the legislature. 38. Video. France legislative elections. How does it work? The French Parliament uses a variant of plurality voting in which it is not enough to get the most votes of any candidate. The winning candidate must get a majority of the vote. This sometimes means that legislative elections require 2 rounds of voting, the first round to narrow the field to 2 candidates and the second round to determine the winner. In plurality or first-past-the-post electoral systems, voters cast a vote directly for the candidate of their choice, and the candidate with the most votes wins the election, regardless of the percentage of the vote share they secure. Because there is a direct relationship between votes cast and election outcomes in these systems, they are generally considered more straightforward than proportional representation systems. However, in these systems, it is extremely difficult for small parties to gain political power. Additionally, legislators can take office in these systems even if the majority of their constituents voted for someone else. For example, in the 2020 United States Senate race in Minnesota, Democratic candidate Tina Smith won re-election with 48.74% of the vote. However, because Republican Jason Lewis got 43.5%, Kevin O'Connor of the Legal Marijuana Now Party got 5.91%, and Oliver Steinberg of the Grassroots Legalized Cannabis Party got 1.78%, a larger total percentage of voters selected someone other than Tina Smith, the winner of the race. 39. While plurality voting is most commonly used in single-member districts, it can also be used in multi-member districts. In those systems, voters are allowed to pick as many candidates as there are seats up for election, and the candidates with the most votes win. For example, in a race with 3 open seats, voters may pick 3 candidates, and the 3 candidates with the highest vote totals win the election. Mixed systems combine aspects of proportional representation and plurality voting systems. While every mixed system is slightly different, the South Korean National Assembly, where 253 seats are elected by plurality voting in single-member districts, and an additional 47 seats are elected at the national level using proportional representation, provides a clear example of how these systems can work. Often, mixed systems use proportional representation seats to help balance out distortions in representation that arise from plurality voting. For example, if a party gained 44% of the vote nationally, but due to results in individual districts, it received more than 51% of the plurality voting seats, the proportional representation-based seats could be adjusted to compensate for the less representative plurality results. 40. In all of these systems, the direct election of legislators creates a system in which legislators are beholden to the people who elected them. That responsibility may be to the people who voted in support of their political party or to the constituents of their geographic districts, but regardless of the voting system, legislators who ignore the will of the people do so at their peril. Some systems offer more protection for individual legislators, such as proportional representation systems in which party leaders select individuals to fill seats, but ultimately, a legislator or party that routinely fails to respond to constituents' desires loses the support of the people. Remember parliamentarian and philosopher Edmund Burke from the earlier discussion of representation? He practiced his idea that the proper role for a legislator was to be a trustee for his constituents, and was voted out of office because people felt he did not sufficiently represent them. The type of electoral system has a significant effect on the number of competitive parties in the political system. That relationship can be summed up by Duverger's law, which states that political systems with plurality voting and single-member districts will have two competitive political parties in each race. 41. In these systems, many voters are less inclined to vote for candidates representing smaller parties, fearing that doing so would amount to wasting their vote given the slim chance those candidates have of winning. 42. This phenomenon occurs at the district level. For example, in a race for the United States Senate seat representing Illinois, only two political parties will be competitive. Duverger's law does not guarantee that there will only be two competitive parties in the legislature. In some settings, two dominant parties do emerge in the legislature, as is the case with the Democratic and Republican parties in United States politics, but in other settings there may be different competitive parties around the country. Following the 2019 elections for the Lok Sabha, the lower chamber of the Indian Parliament, 37 political parties won seats. Yet in individual states, the parties that were most competitive varied considerably. In Gujarat, a state on the western border with Pakistan, the two most competitive parties were the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Indian National Congress, which together received over 95% of votes in the state. In the state of Andhra Pradesh, the two most competitive parties were the Telugu Desam Party and the Yuvajana Sramika Rithu Congress Party, which accounted for approximately 90% of votes in that state. 43. Additionally, Duverger's law does not guarantee that the two competitive parties will stay the same over time, as parties can cycle in and out of power. In the United States, the current Democratic and Republican Party system 44 replaced the Democratic and Whig Party system, which replaced the Democratic, Republican, and Federalist Party system. 45. Video. What is Duverger's law? In this video, Eric Sanders and Aaron Hamlin of the Center for Election Science explain Duverger's law and explore why third parties have so little success in the United States. In some systems, members of the legislature are elected not by the people but by other elected officials. The United States Senate used to be structured this way. Members of the state legislatures who were directly elected by the public had the power to vote for members of the Senate. Though this practice ended in the United States in the early 20th century, similar practices still exist around the world. In the National People's Congress in China, members of the national legislature are elected by the provincial-level legislatures, who are elected by lower levels of assemblies. This means that a successful delegate in the National People's Congress must rise through many rounds of voting at successively higher levels of government, though the first level they must pass through is the public. 46. This electoral design likely means that members of the National People's Congress are more closely aligned with other elected officials and the political party than they are with ordinary voters. Appointment selection. In some systems, the executive has the authority to appoint members to legislative chambers. In systems with either an absolute monarchy or another supreme leader, that leader is empowered to appoint members to the chamber without any public input. Depending on the exact relationship between the leader and the legislature, the appointed members may have the power to propose and pass legislation that originates in the chamber, or they may only be able to approve or reject legislation created by others. Additionally, some places have institutions that claim to be legislatures but lack any independent legislative authority. For example, in Bahrain's National Assembly, the members of the lower chamber, the Majlis al-Nuwab or Council of Representatives, are elected by the people, while the Majlis al-Shura, also known as the Consultative Council, is made up of 40 seats directly appointed by the king. 47 All legislation originates in the Council of Representatives, but in order to become law, it must also be approved by the Consultative Council. However, because of the king's role in selecting and reappointing members of the Consultative Council may feel an obligation to support or oppose a piece of legislation based on the king's preference, rather than their own. Brunei, on the other hand, only has one chamber, a legislative council whose members are appointed by the Sultan. That council does not have any independent lawmaking authority, in part because the Sultan, the Crown Prince, and the cabinet are also on the Legislative Council. 48 Instead, the Sultan creates all laws, and the function of the council is to be a venue for the Sultan to discuss different policy ideas. In other systems, legislators are appointed by a chief executive, such as a president or a prime minister, who is directly accountable to the people. In the Parliament of the Bahamas, the Governor-General, in consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, appoints members to the 16-person Senate. The Prime Minister alone gets to select 9 members, the Leader of the Opposition gets to select 4 members, and after consulting with the Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister selects an additional 3 members. 49 While the public does not directly select the members of the chamber, the leaders who appoint them routinely face public elections. Although public accountability is more distant, a change in the Bahamian public's support for a political party would result in significant changes to the membership of the Senate, which may help make those senators more responsive to the public. Executive appointments can also be used to fill a vacancy between elections. In the United States Senate, a state governor can appoint an individual to fill a vacant seat for the remainder of the term. 50 The appointed senator then must go up for re-election, so although there may be some sense of obligation between the senator and the governor who appointed them, the upcoming election increases the likelihood that the appointee will be responsive to their constituents. Legislative-executive branch relations. While the power of a legislature is greatly shaped by the method used to select its members, that power is also strongly influenced by the relationship between the executive and legislative branches. Remember, most systems have some sort of legislative, executive, and judicial branch structure, but the relationships among the branches and the powers they have can vary widely. Perhaps the most important of these relationships is that between the legislative and the executive. In democratic systems, the key differences between presidential and parliamentary systems relate to the degree of independence of the legislative and executive branches and how much power each has to oversee the actions of the other. Independence. In presidential systems, there is a clear separation of powers between the legislative and the executive. That separation of powers means that one branch makes decisions independently of the other branch, and certain types of authority, such as the authority to raise taxes or declare war, are strictly reserved for one branch. The strength of this separation of powers is that it prevents the aggregation of power in the hands of any one part of government. The weakness, however, is that policy-making can be difficult, particularly when different political parties control the branches, which can lead to heightened political conflict and even gridlock, preventing the government from functioning effectively. Parliamentary systems, on the other hand, have no separation of powers between the legislative and the executive. In fact, the process of selecting an executive comes directly through the legislature. In a parliamentary system, the process starts when the public elects a legislature. Whatever party or coalition gains the majority in the legislature then has the power to pick the prime minister. Prime ministers are part of both the legislature and the executive, exemplifying a complete interdependence of legislative and executive decision-making. The strength of the parliamentary system is that because a legislative majority is required to have executive authority, it is much easier to pass legislation. The weakness of the parliamentary system is that the stability of the government relies on a party or coalition maintaining its control. If there are conflicts within a party or coalition, A vote of no confidence or members defecting can break the majority, which can require new elections, potentially resulting in a new legislature and a new executive. Sri Lankan Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in a turban and glasses and Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa smile and talk. Figure 9. 12 In Sri Lanka, the Prime Minister and the President are partners in governing, as Sri Lanka is a semi-presidential system. In this photo from 2010, then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh speaks with then President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Credit, Photo WA5486L by Public Resource. org/Flickr CC by 20. Semi-presidential systems blend the structures of presidential and parliamentary systems. Every semi-presidential system is slightly different. The blending of the systems leads to some areas of independence, though not the complete independence of a presidential system. Semi-presidential systems often have an independently elected president and a prime minister who is the leader of the legislative majority. In some systems, the two individuals share policymaking power. This is the case in France, where the president and prime minister both have policymaking authority. 51 In semi-presidential systems, the president's authority is not dependent on the legislature, but because of the shared power and responsibilities, the president must still work with the legislative branch to accomplish their goals. Oversight. Earlier, the chapter discussed oversight as it relates to the power the legislature has to oversee the bureaucracy, but oversight can also refer to the powers of the legislative and executive branches to supervise and limit each other's powers. This type of oversight aims to prevent an institution from securing too much power and exerting a corrupting influence. These concerns are fundamental to the presidential system, which was first created in the United States in response to colonists' experience of being subject to the absolute authority of the English monarchy. In a presidential system, each branch has powers separate from those of the other branches, but each also has powers that overlap with the other branches, allowing one branch to step in to stop the excesses of the other. The legislative veto is one example of this kind of oversight. In a typical presidential system, the legislature must pass a piece of legislation, and the president must sign off on it before it goes into effect and becomes a law. A president who does not agree with the legislation can veto the bill, which sends it back to the legislature, providing a check on the legislature's power. In many presidential systems, if the legislature passes the bill again, which usually requires a supermajority, the bill becomes law without the president's support, which is a clear check on the president's power. The two branches are each empowered to oversee and correct the actions of the other. Oversight in parliamentary systems, and thus the relationship between the legislature and the executive, is much different. Because the executive is a part of the legislature, the minority party, rather than another branch of government, is primarily responsible for conducting oversight. Minority parties can use methods such as question time to interrogate the majority's government and then take that information to the public to gain their support. Because parliamentary governments rely on public support to maintain power, a minority party that is able to sway public opinion and potentially get members of the majority to defect on votes can seriously check the power of the majority party. When a majority party is so large with such strong public support that the minority party's threat to go to the public is rendered ineffective, the majority party can hamper the minority party's oversight efforts. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define unicameral and bicameral legislature, outline which types of legislative systems exist in different parts of the world. Analyze the relative advantages and disadvantages of each type of legislative system. One key structural component of legislatures is the number of chambers that they have. The two most common options for chamber structure are unicameral and bicameral. A unicameral legislature has only one chamber or body that makes decisions. A bicameral legislature has two chambers, often with different procedures and powers, that ultimately must work together to make policy and exercise other legislative powers and responsibilities. Strengths and weaknesses of a unicameral legislature. One of the main strengths of unicameral legislatures is that they create a more efficient legislative process. In a unicameral legislature, bills only need to go before and be debated by one set of decision-makers, whereas in a bicameral legislature, both chambers must debate and approve bills in order for them to have a chance of becoming laws. This legislative efficiency is particularly valued in more homogeneous societies, where having venues for different voices and perspectives is not seen as particularly important. In these societies, political parties are considered sufficient to protect diverse interests. Unicameral systems do not lend themselves to oversight and checks on the power of the legislature. In bicameral systems, the need to pass legislation through another chamber is a natural veto point. If there is support for legislation in one chamber but not the other, that may reflect broad concerns of a segment of the public, so the public's preferences are better served when both chambers weigh in and consider a piece of legislation. The lack of a natural veto point is particularly apparent in unicameral parliamentary systems, where a prime minister with a strong governing majority faces almost no constraints from either a separate chamber or an effective minority opposition. Strengths and weaknesses of a bicameral legislature. Bicameral systems make up approximately one-half of legislatures around the world. Bicameralism is largely thought to allow the structures of a political system to reflect different voices and priorities. In bicameral systems, there is often a lower chamber, more closely associated with the perspective of the people, and an upper chamber which might reflect different territories or classes. 52, for example, in the German parliamentary system, the lower chamber, the Bundestag, is directly elected by the public, while the upper chamber, the Bundesrat, is supposed to represent the 16 Länder, or states. While each state has between 3 and 6 votes on legislation, all of a state's votes in the Bundesrat must be cast as a block, either for or against a piece of legislation. 53. The idea is that the vote should represent the state's interests, not the interests of the individuals representing the state. The two chambers create a system of checks and balances within the legislative branch so that any legislation that can survive the legislative branch process is much more likely to succeed. Young adult student journalists wearing lanyards sit facing forward in tiered rows of two-person desks. Figure 9. 13 student journalists participate in a 2017 celebration of youth journalism taking place on the floor of the German Bundesrat. Note how the names of the Länder are affixed to the desks, highlighting the importance of representing a particular region. Credit: Preisverleihung SZW L17 by Jugendpresse Deutschland Timmen Such/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. There are important weaknesses to bicameral systems. First, the legislative process is inefficient. After a bill has been investigated, debated, and voted on in one chamber, it must go to a second chamber and complete the whole process again. This can both significantly extend the time it takes for a piece of legislation to pass and dramatically raise the odds that a piece of legislation will die before it gets to a vote, as at every stage along the way there are two sets of decision-makers who can choose not to proceed with a piece of legislation. This phenomenon played a significant role in preventing comprehensive immigration reform in the United States in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. One nuance of the American legislative process is that bills that haven't passed both chambers of Congress expire at the end of each 2-year session. Although a number of different pieces of immigration legislation were introduced between 2000 and 2020, and some passed either the House or the Senate, no comprehensive immigration legislation was signed into law. 54. Additionally, both chambers must pass the exact same text of legislation. As many systems allow both chambers to amend legislation, a piece of legislation can bounce back and forth between the two chambers until they can agree on a final version. That can also add significant time and inefficiencies to the legislative process. Another weakness of bicameralism is that it can suffer from gridlock when different parties hold the majority in each chamber, particularly when the two parties in charge have significant policy and ideological disagreements. The strengths and weaknesses of bicameralism are two sides of the same coin. A system that, by design, allows for more voices can become a system where nothing can happen, as disagreement in the legislature can cause everything to come to a screeching halt. Show me the data. Frequency of unicameral and bicameral legislatures around the world. A world map codes countries according to whether they have bicameral or unicameral legislatures, some variant, or no legislature at all. Figure 9. 14. Approximately half of the countries around the world have bicameral legislatures in green, while the other half have unicameral legislatures in blue. A few countries, for example China and Iran, have unicameral legislatures with separate advisory bodies, brown, and a couple others have no legislature at all. Red. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. A quick look around the world shows some interesting patterns. Many large countries have a bicameral legislative system. In part, this reflects the influence that the United States and European countries have around the globe. But a significant number of countries, including countries in Western and Southern Africa, Central America, the Middle East, and Northern Europe, as well as many island nations, have unicameral legislatures. What characteristics do you think influence countries to adopt one structure of legislature versus the other? Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the different challenges legislatures face. Articulate the reasons why different types of legislatures may face different challenges. Define party polarization. The political world is in constant flux, with institutions constantly evolving to meet the moment. In many places around the world, despite all the powers that legislatures have and the vital role they play in our political structures, legislatures face significant challenges to their ability to play their prescribed role. Some of these challenges are internal, some are the result of external forces, and some are broader challenges that affect the larger political system. Let's consider three major challenges legislatures face in the 21st century. Executive dominance, legislative deference, and polarization. Growth in executive dominance. Executive dominance is the phenomenon in which leaders, particularly in systems with an executive that is separate from the legislature, expand their powers and justify those expanded powers so that many see them as legitimate and acceptable. Episodes of executive dominance may occur incrementally, with executives taking actions over time that individually represent small expansions of power but ultimately result in large changes. In other cases, executives radically expand their authority, sometimes but not exclusively in times of crisis, and have sufficient support from others in the government, the media, or the public to prevent any effective reprisals for their actions. Regardless of the method of expansion, the act of executive dominance is gradually normalized, forming a new basis for understanding that executive's powers. Executive dominance is a form of external threat to the legislature, as the increased power of the executive often reduces the power of the legislature. For example, in the United States, recent presidents have used executive action, such as executive orders, memoranda, and proclamations, to achieve their policy goals with increasing frequency when they have been unable to accomplish desired policy changes via Congress. Presidents Obama and Trump both relied on executive action to shape immigration and border policy, with President Obama using it to create the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals (DACA) program, and President Trump using it to secure funding for a border wall between the United States and Mexico. Executive dominance also occurs outside the United States. At the beginning of 2020, Russian President Vladimir Putin put forward a number of legislative proposals that successfully changed the Russian constitution to extend his term in office, raising the possibility that he could remain in power for the rest of his lifetime. 55 scholars who have analyzed this legislation highlight that it increases the president's power over the legislature and the judiciary and reduces the power of the Federal Assembly. An open portfolio on a desk shows side-by-side sheets of paper typed with an executive order issued by the President of the United States and signed in the lower right by then-President Donald Trump. Figure 9. 15 modern presidents of the United States have relied more and more heavily on executive action in the last 40 years, particularly as the two political parties in Congress have grown more polarized, making policy change via legislation more difficult to accomplish. Credit: President Trump signs an executive order on strengthening the child welfare system for America's children by Trump White House archived /Andrea Hanks /Flickr, public domain. Whatever the nature of the political system in which it occurs, executive dominance diminishes the power of the legislature, both in terms of the branch's own responsibilities and in terms of its power to check the executive. In most democratic countries, the legislature is responsible for making policy. To justify their efforts to gain more policy-making authority, executives may note the absence of legislation in a particular area. When the executive takes on that authority, legislatures are often unable to gather the necessary support to regain control of that policy area. Additionally, as these kinds of actions become more normalized in the political system, it can become more difficult for legislatures to check the power of the executive, as the more often these actions occur, the less responsive the system becomes to what would have been considered executive overreach in the past. Over time, acts of executive dominance accumulate to shift the balance of power away from the legislature. Growth in legislative deference. Legislatures also face internal threats in the form of legislative deference. Legislative deference occurs when legislatures give power to another branch of government, either by refusing to take action or by approving anything the other branch wants. A legislature may refuse to take action because the executive wants to handle an issue themselves or because the legislature fears being blamed for an unpopular policy. Or the legislature may simply approve or rubber stamp any proposal put forward, usually by the executive. Legislative approval that comes when the legislature has no option other than to approve the measure reflects the weakness of the legislature and poses a clear threat to legislative independence. Executive dominance and legislative deference are distinct but often connected, as it is difficult for an executive to expand their powers without some level of legislative deference, and it can be hard for the legislature to step back and let others make decisions if the executive is not willing to take the lead. Yet the existence of one threat to legislatures does not guarantee the presence of the other. Legislatures can, for example, support an executive's proposal on climate change without actually giving more power to the executive. Legislative deference and executive dominance are more about patterns of behavior over time than about any single decision. Growth in polarization. One of the biggest challenges threatening legislatures is the rise in polarization. Polarization occurs when people or groups are divided between two extremes on an issue or position. Polarization is a systemic threat that can affect politics all across a political system. Often, polarization starts with political actors taking more partisan and ideological positions 56, but over time, voters tend to become more polarized as well, identifying more strongly with a political party or ideology. 57. Party polarization in legislatures can threaten the ability of a legislature to be effective. Many legislatures around the world have seen a rise in the number of seats held by far-right and far-left parties, including the European Parliament following the 2019 elections, which you can learn about in the video below. Polarization has also occurred when parties in the legislature have stayed the same, but the positions those parties hold have become more extreme. In legislatures with either slim majorities or coalition governments, polarization can lead to gridlock, as support will only come from co-partisans. If a party attempts to pass a piece of legislation and faces any internal opposition, the proposal is dead on arrival, as members of minority or opposition parties will often refuse to support the majority's legislation. For much of the 20th century in the United States, members of the Democratic and Republican parties worked together across party lines on legislation. However, since the early 1980s, that has become less and less common, with members increasingly only supporting legislation if it comes from their own party. 58 parties have had to rely more heavily on parliamentary maneuvers to pass any significant legislation, as bipartisan cooperation is anywhere from difficult to near impossible to secure. Video. Populist parties make gains in European Parliament elections. In this segment from CBS News following the results of the European Parliament elections in 2019, journalists analyze what the rise of both right and left populist parties might mean for trans-European legislation and politics. Even in legislatures where one party has a large majority, polarization is still a risk, as it can make the legislation that gets passed more extreme. If public support for that legislation or party dwindles, there is heightened risk that the next election will be a disaster for the current majority, causing control of the legislature to swing from one extreme to another. Political parties with clear positions and differences are useful for winning elections and for public accountability. 59. However, it is dangerous for legislatures when the gap between the parties grows so large that effective legislating grinds to a halt. Connecting courses. Public speaking. German politician Martin Schulz stands at a red podium on an outdoor stage speaking to an assembled crowd while a videographer films the scene. Figure 9. 16 members of the SPD political party listened to a speech by former leader of the European Parliament Martin Schulz in Cologne, Germany. Credit: SPD supporters at a speech by Martin Schulz in Cologne by Marco Virch/Flickr, CC by 2.0. Before running for office, many legislators have other careers. Some are lawyers or business people, while others are doctors, policy advocates, or members of the armed forces. No matter what path people travel before they run for office, all legislators need to develop public speaking skills. Whether on the campaign trail or debating a piece of legislation, the ability to get up and share one's thoughts with a group of people is critical for the successful aspiring legislator or policy advocate. There are a number of different ways you can develop those skills. Your school might offer courses in public speaking or debate, but an acting class in the drama or theater department may also offer you the chance to practice your oratory skills. Additionally, campus activities such as Moot Court or Model United Nations can serve as an excellent way to stretch your public speaking skills while also learning about aspects of political science.